There's something about lighthouses that draws people in. Maybe it's the isolation, the way they stand alone against the elements, battered by wind and sea. Maybe it's the idea of a single light cutting through endless darkness, a promise of safety in a world that doesn't care if you survive the night. Or maybe it's because, deep down, we all know that places like that, places on the edge of the world, are where the strangest things happen. I never believed in ghost stories, not really. But after what I've seen, I can't laugh them off anymore. These are 3 stories I've collected, each one true, each one more unsettling than the last. If you've ever wondered what really happens in the lonely towers at the edge of the world, listen closely. Some lights are meant to warn you away. Story 1. The Keeper's Last Watch. My Uncle Thomas was a lighthouse keeper on the northern coast of Maine. He was the kind of man who didn't scare us. He'd spent most of his life alone, tending to the light, keeping the logs, and making sure the beacon never went out. He used to say the sea was a living thing, always hungry, always watching. I thought he was just being dramatic, until the winter he disappeared. It was the coldest January anyone could remember. The sea froze in the shallows, and the wind howled so loud it rattled the glass in the tower. My uncle's lighthouse was only accessible by boat, and for weeks, the ice made it impossible to reach him. He radioed in every day, his voice steady, never complaining. Then, one night, the radio went silent. The Coast Guard sent a team as soon as the weather broke. They found the lighthouse locked from the inside. The logs were up to date, the lamp was full of oil, and the beacon was still burning. But my uncle was gone. No sign of a struggle, no footprints in the snow. Nothing but a single set of wet boot prints leading from the base of the tower to the edge of the cliff. The prints stopped at the very edge, as if he'd stepped off into thin air. The official report said he must have slipped and fallen into the sea, but I never believed it. My uncle was careful, especially in winter. He knew those rocks better than anyone. I went out there myself a week later, determined to find some clue the searchers had missed. The lighthouse was exactly as they'd left it, cold, empty, echoing with the sound of the wind. I climbed the spiral stairs to the lantern room, half expecting to find him waiting for me, but there was only the endless grey sea. I spent the night in the keeper's quarters, wrapped in his old blanket, listening to the storm. Around midnight, I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow, deliberate, heavy. I called out, thinking maybe someone from the Coast Guard had come back, but no one answered. The footsteps stopped outside the door. I held my breath, waiting, but nothing happened. After a few minutes, I worked up the nerve to open the door. The hallway was empty, but the floor was wet, as if someone had come in from the storm. I barely slept. In the morning, I found a single boot print in the kitchen, pressed into the dust. It was too big to be mine, and it was still damp. I left that day and never went back. Sometimes, when the wind is right, I swear I can hear my uncle's voice on the radio, calling out from somewhere beyond the edge of the world. Story 2. The light that shouldn't be. The second story comes from a friend of mine, Sarah, who worked as a marine biologist on the Great Lakes. She was part of a team studying invasive species, and they'd set up a temporary lab in an old lighthouse on a remote island. The place hadn't been used in years, but the light still worked, and the view was incredible. Sarah loved it, at first. The trouble started on the 3rd night. She was alone in the tower, cataloging samples, when she noticed the light was on. That wouldn't have been strange, except she hadn't turned it on, and the power was supposed to be off. She climbed up to the lantern room to check, thinking maybe a generator had kicked in by mistake. The room was empty, but the lamp was burning, casting a pale, sickly glow over the water. She tried to turn it off, but the switch wouldn't budge. The whole mechanism felt wrong, sticky and cold, like it had been underwater. She gave up and went back downstairs, figuring she'd deal with it in the morning. But as she was falling asleep, she saw another light out on the water. A small, flickering flame, moving closer to the island. She watched from the window as the light drifted toward shore. It stopped just beyond the rocks, bobbing on the waves. Sarah thought it might be a boat, but she couldn't see anyone. Then, the light went out, and the air in the room turned freezing cold. She heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and dragging, like someone was pulling themselves up one step at a time. She locked the door and waited, heart pounding. The footsteps stopped outside her room, and she heard a voice whisper her name. Not a shout, not a call, just a whisper, so soft she almost thought she'd imagined it. She didn't sleep at all that night. In the morning she found wet footprints leading from the front door to the base of the stairs. The light in the lantern room was off, and the switch worked fine. She packed up her things and left the island that afternoon, refusing to ever go back. The rest of her team thought she'd had a breakdown, but I believe her. Some lights aren't meant to be seen. The third story is the one that keeps me up at night. It's not about a family member or a friend. but about a place I visited once, years ago, when I was still in college. I was studying architecture, and my professor arranged a field trip to a decommissioned lighthouse on the Oregon coast. The place was famous for its design: octagonal tower, spiral staircase, original Fresnel lens still intact, but the locals whispered about it for other reasons. We arrived on a gray morning, the sky low and heavy with rain. The lighthouse stood on a rocky outcrop, battered by waves that sent spray high into the air. The keeper's house was boarded up, but the tower itself was open for tours. Our guide was a woman in her 60s, with a voice like gravel and eyes that never seemed to blink. She told us about the history of the place, the storms it had survived, the ships it had saved, but she never mentioned the stories. After the tour, I wandered off on my own, drawn by the sound of the sea. I found a narrow path that led around the base of the tower, where the rocks were slick with moss and the air smelled of salt and rot. I was about to turn back when I heard a tapping sound, faint but insistent, coming from inside the wall. I pressed my ear to the cold stone and listened. Tap, tap, tap. Then a pause. Then 3 more taps. Slower, heavier. I thought maybe it was just the wind, or water dripping somewhere inside the structure. But as I walked back toward the entrance, I heard it again. This time from the other side of the tower. Tap, tap, tap. I followed the sound, my heart beating faster. It led me to a small, rusted door at the base of the lighthouse, half hidden by overgrown grass. The door was locked, but I could see fresh scratches around the handle, as if someone had tried to force it open. I asked the guide about the door, but she just shook her head. "That's the old oil room," she said. "Nothing in there but rust and cobwebs." But her voice was tight, and she wouldn't meet my eyes. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about the tapping, the scratches on the door, the way the guide had avoided my questions. I got up around midnight and walked back to the lighthouse, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the fog. The place was deserted, the only sound, the crash of waves and the distant call of a foghorn. I circled the tower, listening. The tapping started again, louder this time, echoing through the stone. I found myself standing in front of the oil room door, my hand on the cold metal handle. I knew I shouldn't open it, but curiosity got the better of me. I pulled, and to my surprise, the door swung open with a groan. Inside the room was pitch black, the air thick with the smell of old oil and damp stone. I shone my light around, searching for the source of the sound. The walls were covered in deep gouges, as if someone had clawed at the stone for years. In the far corner, I saw something that made my blood run cold, a set of old rusted shackles bolted to the wall, the metal worn smooth by years of use. As I stepped closer, the tapping stopped. The room felt colder, the air heavy and still. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut behind me, plunging me into darkness. I pounded on the door, shouting for help, but my voice was swallowed by the thick stone walls. Then, from the darkness, I heard a voice, soft, broken, barely more than a whisper. "Help me." I spun around, shining my light into the corners of the room. There was no one there, just the empty shackles and the marks on the walls. The voice came again, closer this time. "Please, let me out." I felt something brush past me, cold and wet, like a hand reaching out from the darkness. I stumbled back, my heart racing, and the door creaked open behind me. I didn't look back. I ran out into the night, not stopping until I reached the safety of my hotel room. The next morning, I told my professor what had happened. He listened quietly, then told me a story I'll never forget. Years ago, when the lighthouse was still in use, a keeper had gone mad during a long winter storm. He locked himself in the oil room, convinced that something was trying to get in. When they finally broke down the door, they found him dead, his hands worn raw from clawing at the walls. Some say his spirit never left, trapped in the stone, tapping out a message no one can understand. I never went back to that lighthouse, but sometimes, when I'm alone at night, I hear tapping on the walls of my apartment. 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 3 more. I tell myself it's just the pipes, or the neighbors, or the wind. But deep down, I know better. These stories aren't just tales to scare children. They're warnings. Lighthouses stand at the edge of the world for a reason. They keep the darkness at bay, but sometimes, the darkness finds a way in. If you ever find yourself alone in a lighthouse, listen to the wind, watch the waves, and whatever you do, don't ignore the signs. Some lights are meant to guide you home. Others are there to keep you away. I used to think stories like these were just the product of lonely minds and too many stormy nights. But the more I listened, the more I realized that every lighthouse has its secrets, and every keeper has a story they won't tell. After those 3 accounts, I started collecting more. reaching out to people who'd spent time in these isolated towers. Some were eager to talk, desperate to share what they'd seen. Others refused, their voices tight with fear, as if speaking the words would bring the darkness back. One of the most unsettling things I learned is how similar the stories are, no matter where the lighthouse stands. Whether it's perched on a rocky cliff in Maine, standing guard over the Great Lakes, or battered by Pacific storms, the details repeat. Footsteps in empty halls, lights that flicker on when no one is there, voices calling out from the fog. It's as if the lighthouses themselves remember, holding on to every tragedy, every secret, every lost soul. I started to wonder if there was something about the job itself, something about the isolation, the endless routine, the responsibility of keeping the light burning, that made people see things. Or maybe it's the places themselves, built on the edge of the world, where the boundary between land and sea, life and death, is thin. Whatever the reason, the stories kept coming. I spoke to a retired keeper named Bill, who'd worked at a lighthouse on Lake Superior for nearly 20 years. He told me about a night when the fog was so thick he couldn't see the end of the pier. He was making his rounds when he heard someone calling his name from the rocks below. At first, he thought it was a fisherman in trouble, but when he shone his light down, there was no one there, just the swirling mist and the crash of waves. The voice kept calling, growing more desperate, until it was right outside the door. Bill locked himself in the lantern room and waited for dawn. When he finally went outside, he found wet footprints leading up the stairs. Stopping at the door, he never saw anyone, but he never forgot the sound of that voice. Another story came from a woman named Marisol who spent a summer volunteering at a lighthouse museum in California. She was closing up one evening when she heard music coming from the tower, an old scratchy tune like something from a gramophone. She climbed the stairs, expecting to find a tourist who'd stayed behind, but the tower was empty. The music faded as she reached the top, replaced by the sound of someone humming softly in the dark. She left the building and never went back after sunset. I even heard from a Coast Guard officer who'd been stationed at a remote lighthouse in Alaska. He told me about a night when the light went out during a storm. He climbed the tower to relight it, but when he reached the top, he found the lantern room filled with water, as if the sea had broken through the glass. He waded through the freezing water to reach the lamp, and as he did, he saw faces in the waves, pale, staring, mouths open in silent screams. He managed to relight the lamp, and the water drained away as suddenly as it had appeared. But he never forgot the feeling of those eyes watching him from the deep. These stories aren't just about ghosts or monsters. They're about the weight of responsibility, the fear of failure, the knowledge that a single mistake could mean disaster for someone out at sea. Lighthouses are built to save lives, but they're also places of loss, memorials to those who didn't make it home. Maybe that's why the stories linger, why the past refuses to stay buried. After hearing so many accounts, I started to notice something else. The people who spend time in lighthouses often change. They become quieter, more withdrawn, as if the isolation seeps into their bones. Some develop rituals, knocking on the walls before bed, leaving a light on in every room, never looking directly into the mirror after midnight. They don't talk about what they've seen, but you can see it in their eyes. I remember visiting a lighthouse in Scotland, perched on a windswept cliff above the North Sea. The keeper, an old man named Angus, showed me around, pointing out the original stonework and the ancient bell that still rang in storms. As we climbed the stairs, he told me about the watchers, shadows that moved just out of sight, faces that appeared in the glass when the fog rolled in. He said they were the souls of lost sailors, drawn to the light, unable to move on. When I asked if he'd ever seen them himself, he just smiled, a sad, knowing smile. We all see them, lad. The trick is not to let them see you. That night, I stayed in the guest quarters, listening to the wind howl around the tower. I woke up just before dawn, the room icy cold. I heard footsteps on the stairs, slow and heavy, and the sound of the bell ringing in the storm. I lay there, heart pounding, until the sun rose and the sounds faded away. I left the next day, but the memory stayed with me. I still dream about that lighthouse, about the faces in the glass, and the sound of the bell. Sometimes, I wonder if the stories are a warning, a way of reminding us that some places are meant to be left alone. If you ever find yourself drawn to a lighthouse, remember these stories. Remember the keepers who vanished, the lights that burned when they shouldn't, the voices that call out from the fog. And if you hear footsteps on the stairs, or tapping on the walls, or your name whispered in the dark, don't answer. Some lights are meant to guide you home, others are there to keep you away. I thought I could leave the stories behind, but the truth is, they follow you. After I started sharing what I'd learned, people began reaching out to me. Strangers from all over the world, each with their own lighthouse story. Some were short, just a strange noise or a fleeting shadow. Others were long, detailed accounts of nights spent alone with something they couldn't explain. The more I listened, the more I realized that the line between fact and legend is thinner than I ever imagined. One message came from a man named Peter, who'd worked as a contractor restoring old lighthouses along the East Coast. He told me about a job on a tiny island off Rhode Island, a place so remote it didn't even have a name on most maps. The lighthouse there was crumbling, battered by decades of storms. Peter and his crew were supposed to shore up the foundation and replace the roof, but from the moment they arrived, things felt wrong. The first night, Peter woke to the sound of someone walking around the tower. He thought it was one of his crew, but when he checked, everyone was asleep. The footsteps continued, circling the lighthouse, slow and deliberate. In the morning they found muddy footprints on the stairs, bare feet, too large to belong to anyone on the crew. The second night, the generator failed, plunging the island into darkness. Peter lay awake, listening to the wind howl through the broken windows. Around midnight, he heard a voice outside, calling his name. He tried to ignore it, but the voice grew louder, more insistent, until it was right outside his door. He finally got up the courage to look, but there was no one there, just the empty night and the endless sea. On the third night, one of the crew disappeared. They searched the island, but there was no trace of him, no footprints, no sign of a struggle, nothing but his boots left neatly by the door. The Coast Guard came out the next day, but they never found him. Peter finished the job as quickly as he could and never went back. Another story came from a woman named Leela who inherited a lighthouse from her grandfather on the Gulf Coast. She moved in, hoping for a fresh start, but the place was never truly hers. Every night, she heard the sound of someone climbing the stairs, slow and heavy, as if dragging a chain. She found wet handprints on the walls, puddles of salt water in the kitchen, and once, a single sodden boot at the foot of her bed. Lila tried to ignore the signs, telling herself it was just the old building settling, or her imagination running wild. But the dreams started, vivid, terrifying dreams of drowning, of cold hands pulling her down into the dark. She woke up gasping for air, her sheets soaked with sweat. One night she dreamed she was standing at the top of the tower, looking out at the sea. A figure stood beside her, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow. It reached out and touched her arm, and she woke up screaming, the skin on her arm cold and wet. She left the lighthouse the next day, leaving everything behind. She never went back, and she never looked at the sea the same way again. I started to see a pattern in these stories, a sense of something unfinished, something waiting. Lighthouses are supposed to be places of safety, but for the people who live and work in them, they can become prisons. The isolation, the endless routine, the weight of responsibility, it all adds up, wearing people down until they start to see things, hear things, feel things that shouldn't be there. But sometimes, it's not just the mind playing tricks. Sometimes, the things people see are real. I got a letter from a man named George, who'd spent his whole life working on ships. He told me about a night when his vessel ran aground near a lighthouse on the Irish coast. The weather was terrible, the sea raging, the wind howling like a living thing. George and his crew made it to shore, battered and exhausted, and took shelter in the lighthouse. The keeper welcomed them in, gave them blankets and hot tea, and let them sleep in the keeper's quarters. But George couldn't sleep. He kept hearing voices in the wind, whispers that seemed to come from the walls themselves. Around midnight he got up to use the bathroom and found the hallway filled with fog, thick, swirling, cold as ice. He heard footsteps behind him, slow and heavy, and turned to see a figure standing at the end of the hall. The figure was tall, dressed in an old-fashioned keeper's uniform, his face pale and gaunt. He stared at George with empty eyes, then turned and walked through a closed door, vanishing into the fog. George ran back to the quarters and locked the door, heart pounding. In the morning, the fog was gone, and the keeper acted as if nothing had happened. When George told him what he'd seen, the keeper just nodded. "You're not the first," he said, "and you won't be the last. These stories aren't just about haunted buildings or restless spirits. They're about the things we carry with us, the guilt, the fear, the memories that refuse to fade." Lighthouses are places of transition, standing between land and sea, light and darkness, life and death. Maybe that's why they attract so many stories, so many lost souls. If you ever find yourself drawn to a lighthouse, remember, the light is there to guide you, but it can't protect you from everything. Some things are older than the sea, older than the stones themselves, and some stories are still waiting to be told. After years of collecting these stories, I started to notice how the details would change depending on who was telling them, but the feeling was always the same. It was never just fear, It was a sense of being watched, of being measured, of something waiting just out of sight. I began to wonder if the lighthouses themselves were somehow alive, or if they were just magnets for the things that slip through the cracks in the world. I went back to visit the main coast, where my uncle had vanished all those years ago. The lighthouse was still there, battered by storms, its paint peeling, the glass in the lantern room fogged with salt. The new keeper, a woman named Ruth, let me inside. She'd heard about my uncle, and she'd heard the stories too. She told me she didn't believe in ghosts, but she always left a cup of coffee on the kitchen table at midnight, just in case. We sat in the keeper's quarters, drinking coffee as the wind howled outside. Ruth told me about the things she'd seen, shadows moving in the lantern room, the sound of footsteps on the stairs, the radio crackling with voices that weren't hers. She said she'd learned not to ask questions, not to look too closely at the things that didn't make sense. The sea takes what it wants, she said. All we can do is keep the light burning. That night, I stayed in the lighthouse, determined to see for myself. I walked the halls, climbed the stairs, listened to the wind and the waves. Around midnight, I heard the radio crackle to life, a voice whispering my name. I froze, heart pounding, but the voice faded as quickly as it had come. I checked the kitchen. Ruth's coffee cup was empty, a ring of salt left at the bottom. I didn't sleep much. In the morning, Ruth made breakfast and acted as if nothing had happened. I asked her if she'd ever thought about leaving, and she just smiled. Someone has to keep the light burning, she said. If I leave, who will take my place? I left the lighthouse with more questions than answers. The stories I'd collected had started to feel less like warnings and more like invitations, an endless chain, each keeper passing the torch to the next, each story waiting for someone new to hear it. I started to wonder if that was the real horror of lighthouses, not the ghosts or the shadows, but the way they draw people in, the way they make you part of their story. Maybe that's why so many keepers stay, even when they're afraid. Maybe that's why I keep coming back. A few months later, I got a call from Sarah, the marine biologist from the Great Lakes. She'd moved on, taken a job in a city far from the water, but she couldn't shake the feeling that something was following her. She said she'd started seeing lights in her apartment at night, small, flickering glows that moved across the walls. She heard footsteps in the hallway, voices whispering her name. She asked if I thought she was going crazy. I told her she wasn't alone. I told her about the other stories, about the people who'd left the lighthouses but couldn't leave the darkness behind. I told her that sometimes, the things we see in the dark are just memories, but sometimes, there's something more. Sarah thanked me, but I could hear the fear in her voice. She said she was thinking about going back to the lighthouse, just to see if the lights would stop. I told her to be careful, to remember the stories, to never ignore the signs. I kept in touch with Ruth, too. She sent me postcards from the Maine coast, short notes about storms and shipwrecks and the endless work of keeping the light burning. She never mentioned the ghosts, but sometimes her handwriting would trail off, as if she'd been interrupted. Once, she sent a photo of the lighthouse at sunset, the sky blazing orange and red. In the window of the lantern room, I could just make out a shadow, tall and thin, watching the sea. I started to realize that the stories would never end. As long as there were lighthouses, as long as there were people willing to stand watch at the edge of the world, there would be new tales to tell. Some would be about ghosts, some about monsters, some about the darkness inside us all. But they would all share the same feeling, the sense of being watched, of being chosen, of being part of something older and stranger than we can understand. I began to write my own story, not just as a collector of tales, but as someone who had lived them. I wrote about my uncle, about Sarah, about Ruth, about the faces in the glass and the voices in the wind. I wrote about the fear and the fascination, the way the lighthouses called to me, the way I couldn't stay away. One night, as I was finishing a chapter, I heard a tapping on my window. 3 quick taps, then a pause, then 3 more. I froze, the pen slipping from my hand. I told myself it was just a branch, just the wind, but I knew better. I got up and looked outside, but the street was empty. The night silent. I went back to my desk and found a ring of salt on the surface, just like the one in Ruth's coffee cup. I brushed it away, but the feeling lingered, the sense that I was being watched, that the story wasn't finished. If you're listening to this, if you've ever felt the pull of a lighthouse, if you've ever heard footsteps in an empty room or seen a light where there shouldn't be one, you're not alone. The stories are waiting for you, just as they waited for me. And if you ever find yourself standing at the edge of the world, looking out at the endless sea, remember, some lights are meant to guide you home, others are there to keep you away. I used to think I was just an observer, someone who could collect these stories and walk away unchanged. But the truth is, the stories change you. They settle into your bones, echo in your dreams, and make you question every shadow, every unexplained sound. I started to notice things in my own life, small things. At first, the way the light in my hallway would flicker at odd hours, the way my reflection sometimes seemed a half-second slow in the bathroom mirror, the way I'd wake up at exactly 2:14 a.m. with the feeling that someone was standing at the foot of my bed. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself it was just my imagination, the result of too many late nights and too many ghost stories. But the feeling never went away. If anything, it grew stronger. I started to keep a journal, just like the lighthouse keepers in the stories I'd collected. I wrote down every strange occurrence, every dream, every time I heard footsteps in the hallway when I knew I was alone. The entries piled up, page after page of small, unsettling details. I told myself it was just a way to process my fears, to keep them from taking over. But deep down, I wondered if I was just adding another chapter to the same old story. One night, I woke to the sound of the foghorn. I live miles from the sea, but the sound was unmistakable, low, mournful, echoing through the darkness. I got up and looked out the window, half expecting to see the beam of a lighthouse sweeping across the sky. But there was nothing, just the empty street and the distant glow of city lights. I went back to bed, but I couldn't sleep. The sound of the foghorn lingered, growing fainter with each passing minute, until it was gone. The next morning, I found a small puddle of salt water on my kitchen floor. There was no leak, no broken pipe, no explanation. I cleaned it up and tried to forget about it, but the feeling of unease stayed with me all day. That night, I dreamed I was standing at the top of a lighthouse, looking out at a stormy sea. The light was out, and the darkness pressed in from all sides. I heard footsteps behind me, slow and heavy, and a voice whispered my name. I turned, but there was no one there, just the empty tower and the endless sound of the waves. I started to wonder if the stories I'd collected were more than just stories. Maybe they were warnings, or maybe they were invitations. Maybe, by listening to them, by sharing them, I'd opened a door that couldn't be closed. I thought about Sarah, about Ruth, about all the others who'd reached out to me with their own tales of lighthouses and shadows and things that waited in the dark. I wondered how many of them had found peace, and how many were still looking over their shoulders, waiting for the next sign. I decided to visit one last lighthouse, a place I'd read about in an old journal but had never seen for myself. It stood on a rocky island off the coast, accessible only by boat. The locals called it the Last Light, and they said it was the oldest lighthouse in the region, built before the town even existed. The stories about it were older still, tales of shipwrecks, of vanished keepers, of a light that sometimes shone even when the tower was empty. I made the trip in late autumn, when the sea was rough and the sky was always gray. The boatman who ferried me out to the island wouldn't meet my eyes. He dropped me at the dock and told me he'd be back at dawn. "Don't stay past sunrise," he warned. "No one ever does." The lighthouse was smaller than I expected, squat and weathered, its paint peeling in long strips. The door was unlocked, swinging open on rusty hinges. Inside, the air was cold and damp, thick with the smell of salt and old stone. I climbed the stairs, my footsteps echoing in the narrow shaft. At the top, the lantern room was empty, the glass streaked with rain. The lamp itself was dark, but as I stood there, I felt a presence behind me, a weight in the air, a sense of being watched. I turned, but the room was empty. Still, the feeling didn't leave. I walked back down the stairs, pausing at each landing to listen. The silence was absolute, broken only by the distant crash of waves. I reached the keeper's quarters and found a journal on the table, its pages yellowed with age. The handwriting was neat, careful, and the last entry was dated exactly 1 year before. "If you are reading this, you are the next. The light must be kept burning. If it goes out, the darkness comes in. I have seen it. I have felt it. I am sorry." I closed the journal and sat in the empty room, listening to the wind. I thought about all the stories I'd heard, all the people who'd stood watch in places like this, all the lights that had burned through the night. I wondered how many of them had made it home, and how many had become part of the story themselves. As the sun began to rise, I left the lighthouse and walked back to the dock. The boatman was waiting, his face pale in the morning light. He didn't speak as I climbed aboard, and we rowed back to shore in silence. As the island faded into the mist, I looked back and saw the light in the tower flicker on, burning bright against the gray sky. I don't know if I'll ever go back. Maybe I've had enough of lighthouses, enough of stories that never really end. But sometimes, late at night, I hear the sound of the foghorn, and I wonder if the light is still burning, if the darkness is still waiting just beyond the edge of the world. If you ever find yourself drawn to a lighthouse, remember, You're not just a visitor, you're part of the story now, and some stories, once begun, can never truly be left behind.